Well, since the start of the lockdown, my online church offerings have all been focusing on the gospel readings in our sermons. Now, these seem like the most obvious go-to bits of the Bible for a church to be teaching, don't they? The Gospels. I mean, they're directly about the ministry and teaching of Jesus himself. Indeed, why would we look anywhere else? This may be a question you're asking, as today we switch to spending some time focusing on the Old Testament readings as we follow them through the mid-chapters of Genesis over the coming weeks. I mean, sure, you might think, when the Old Testament was all the people had, better to read that than nothing. But why would we bother when we can just read about Jesus in the Gospels? Isn't that like spending time watching trailers for a film when the film itself is already on Netflix? Well, the desire implicit in that question, to want to keep focusing on Jesus, is a great desire. But the thing to realise is that by looking at the Old Testament, we are not losing our focus on Jesus. You may remember my sermon from several weeks ago on Luke 24:13-35, Jesus on the road to Emmaus. There, Jesus takes the only Bible they had at the time, the Old Testament, and says, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. All scripture is about Jesus, says Jesus, and he'd know. Or elsewhere, as Jesus says in Matthew 5:17, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets, the Old Testament. I haven't come to abolish, but to fulfill them. Partly this means that all the great themes, pictures, laws, religious practices and ceremonies of the Old Testament point to Jesus, and that he's the perfection of all that's good in the great heroes of the Old Testament. So these things illuminate different aspects of Jesus' character and teaching. So we come to understand Jesus better by understanding the Old Testament better. But it's also important to realise that Jesus didn't just suddenly turn up one day saying, oh, hi, by the way, I'm sent by God. In fact, I am God. Now listen to this. Jesus is, very literally, the fulfilment of all the plans, purposes and promises of God throughout history, as revealed in the Old Testament. He is the one who completes the plans, brings about the purposes, and is the answer to the promises. I mean, that's why, on the road to Emmaus, Jesus could say to the disciples, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that Christ should suffer these things and enter into glory?" He could say that because God had already told them throughout the Old Testament that his Messiah was going to come and do these things. So they shouldn't have been surprised when Jesus turned up, fulfilling all the prophecies about the Messiah as he did so, and did all the things that God had said he'd do. So as we read the Old Testament, we get to know the full sweep of God's plans and purposes, and so we get a much better grasp on the ministry and teaching of Jesus that's fulfilling those plans and purposes. I realise that here I'm spending a long time on the introduction, but I'm aware that for some listening, this might be, apart from a few famous stories like David and Goliath, your first deep dive into the Old Testament. So I think it's important to take a bit of time to explain to you why this is worth our while. Plus, what we've just seen about how Jesus fulfills the Old Testament also shows us how we're to read the Old Testament. We're to read it thinking, how does this in some way point to Jesus? Now remember, sometimes the Old Testament points to Jesus in a positive sense. God gives this promise, so we see how Jesus fulfills it. We read of a religious ceremony. How does that illuminate an aspect of Jesus' ministry? we hear the words of a prophet or an Old Testament character acting faithfully. Well, how is the teaching or character of Jesus the perfection of that? But sometimes Scripture points to Jesus in a negative sense. We see people acting terribly, things going wrong, a desperate need for something that's lacking there and then. And this makes us long for someone to fix things, to provide for the need that was lacking. And it's Jesus who answers that longing. So as we read the Old Testament, it's important to bear in mind that just because the Bible records certain events or actions, that doesn't necessarily mean it commends them. Indeed, the Bible is refreshingly honest in its warts and all portrayal of even its heroes, and the frequent messiness and sometimes shocking tragedy of human behaviour. Yet, we see God at work throughout all these things, redeeming, healing, correcting, ministering his grace, and bringing about his plans despite human sinfulness. And this is yet another reason to read the Old Testament. Throughout it, we see ordinary people just like us, with all their faults and failings, just like ours, being used by God in extraordinary ways. So all these things are reasons why, as Paul writes in 2 Timothy 3:16, all Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. So as we read Genesis, we are reading words breathed out by God himself, inspired, authoritative, infallible. And I pray that by his Spirit we will all find Genesis useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training us in righteousness. Now, having taken some time, usefully I hope, introducing the Old Testament as a whole, I'm now going to give us a quick overview of Genesis chapters 1 to 17 to set the scene for where we're up to as we start this week from Genesis 18. Now, this does mean that this week we're only going to be able to look briefly at Genesis 18, 1 to 15 itself. We'll just note some main points from it. But what I'm mainly doing today is the overall surveying work and preparing us with the tools that will then enable us to dig into the specific Genesis passages in much more detail from next week. One important thing to note regarding the storyline throughout not just Genesis but the whole Bible is that Genesis chapters 1 to 11 are a big picture about the whole of creation and humanity. Then at the start of Genesis chapter 12, we see God speaking to Abraham, or Abram as he was still known at that point. Things become a lot more focused on Abraham and his descendants, who become Israel. But, as we'll see, the focus on this particular man and his family doesn't mean that the rest of humanity is forgotten about. Far from it. So, in Genesis 1 and 2, we see God creating a perfect world into which he places us, people, men and women made in his image, tasked with caring for his creation. But in Genesis 3, things go badly wrong. Adam, the first man, misuses the freedom he has as a creature made in God's image, and he and his wife Eve sin, eating from the one tree that God had said was off limits, despite being surrounded by the bounty of Eden that was theirs for the taking. Sin has serious consequences. That's why God takes it so seriously. So the entry of sin into the world causes humanity and all creation to fall. It falls from the perfection in which it had been created, and it falls under the curse of God's righteous judgment. And from then on, the negative effects of sin spread and do their nasty work, so nothing in creation works quite as it should. And all people are now born with an innate tendency to sin, and our sin leaves us cut off from our perfect, holy God. We see the terrible outworkings of this reality in the chapters that follow, through Cain and Abel, Noah, the Tower of Babel, until we're thinking, things are a mess, they're getting worse, there's no hope, no way back to Eden, no way to fix our broken relationship with God, no way that God's going to do anything but just give up on humanity for good. But no, God is not in the business of giving up. And in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, he shows that he has great plans to sort out the mess that we've made of things. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and those who dishonor you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." God has great plans to undo the curse of our sin and to bless. And did you hear? Not just to bless Abraham and his descendants, but to bless all the families of the earth, to bless all peoples everywhere, without distinction or discrimination. God's focus on Abraham and his family in particular is for the blessing of all. These great promises to Abraham and his descendants are promises through Abraham to us, to everyone. So chapters 12 to 17 then are about Abraham wrestling with trusting in God to fulfill his promises, as at times he does, being a great example to us of faith as he does so. But at other times, we see Abraham doubting God's faithfulness, so thinking he needs to make things happen himself rather than trusting in God, with predictably messy results. So then we come to Genesis chapter 18, and the pressing issue is that God has promised he will make Abraham into a great nation, that he'll have so many descendants they'll become a whole people whom God will bless. And yet, both he and his wife Sarah are old, and even in their youth, Sarah was never able to have children. So into this context, as Abraham takes a siesta at the start of Genesis 18, walk 3 men, or apparently men, because we learn as the passage unfolds that they're actually angels, and that one of them is even the angel of the Lord, a mysterious figure who appears throughout the Old Testament, and who in some sense is God himself, or is at least the means by which God presents himself and speaks in person. Yet we begin by seeing things from Abraham's point of view in verses 1 to 9, and he sees only men. And he shows classic Near Eastern hospitality in seeing these travellers and immediately jumping to his feet to provide them with the best that he has while they refresh themselves. Abraham here is certainly a great example to us of hospitality, of seeing a need in others, in this case some weary travellers in the hot sun, and meeting that need. Not just doing the least we can do, but the best. And having received Abraham's hospitality graciously, the perspective then switches from verse 10 to God's perspective, as one of the angels reveals himself to be an angel, indeed to be the angel of the Lord, because as he speaks, we're told that the Lord speaks. and says something that only God could know, indeed that only God could have done. That Sarah, his elderly, infertile wife, would bear him a son. God promises a child, an incredible promise to any couple struggling with infertility. And yet here, so much more even than that. For this promised child is the child who will enable the great promises that God made in chapter 12 to be fulfilled. If Abraham can't even have one child, how can he possibly become the father of a great nation? And how then could all families, all peoples, be blessed, since we were depending on being blessed through them? God's plans would be scuppered right at the start. And Sarah's reaction to hearing that she'll have a child is hardly surprising. How on earth could this be true? She laughs, quite possibly not out of simple incredulity, but maybe out of self-protection, not wanting to let herself believe this thing that seems too good to be true after so many years of disappointment. But of course, God's promises are true. I will surely return to you, he says, and Sarah your wife will have a son, a promised child who will be the beginning of the fulfillment of all God's promises. A promised child who points forward to another child born in miraculous circumstances. While Sarah was old and infertile, Mary was a virgin. Yet God too gave her a child who was born into the family of Abraham, a child who would be the fulfillment of all God's promises. And we'll see how that unfolds over the coming weeks. At times we can wonder how on earth God's promises and purposes will be fulfilled. What can he possibly be doing when everything seems to be going wrong? But we see through the story of Abraham and Sarah and their descendants, God is true. Abraham, with ups and downs, ultimately trusted him, and so can we. Amen.